Today, it is my privilege and pleasure to be speaking with Brad Agle, who is the George W. Romney Endowed Professor of Ethics and Leadership at the Marriott School of Business, Brigham Young University in Utah, USA. Brad is also a visiting fellow at the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University and a visiting professor at Bath in the United Kingdom. So many strings to his bow. He's spread far and wide. I met Brad back in 2016, was it, Brad, when you spoke in London?
That's correct, 2016.
2016, back in 2016. So I have personal experience in listening to Brad talking about ethics and the value of ethics in business. And today I really wanted to talk with Brad about, I suppose you might say, the business case for good ethics in a business context, because a lot of times ethics kind of gets poo-pooed, or it's a tick box that people have to take care of, and it's not always taken very seriously. So my thinking was that somebody like Brad is very well positioned to talk to us about why business people, hard-nosed business people, numbers-focused business people should really care about ethics in business. So Brad, what would you say are the headlines in terms of why business people should care about ethics in business?
Well, first, Tom, thanks for having me with you. I look forward to our conversation. This is obviously a point that a lot of people bring up. Probably there's no comment that you get more often as a business ethics professor than, isn't that an oxymoron? The question about the role of ethics in business is an important one, particularly when it relates to success in business. As a professor of business ethics, there's no comment I get more often when someone finds out that I'm a professor of business ethics. When they say business ethics, they say, isn't that an oxymoron? Or two things that do not go together. In fact, I just started a cruise yesterday, went and had dinner last night. People sitting next to me, as soon as they started finding out that I'm a professor of business ethics, he was looking for the word. It took him a little while, but finally he found it. I knew what he was looking for as soon as he started talking. Oxymoron. And I'm here to say that absolutely, it's not an oxymoron. Ethics is absolutely critical to business success. So when I have people who are, somewhat negative about business, or the notion that, business provides value or is somehow ethical, I first say, well, what does ethics mean? Well, ethics is about how we treat other people. So to be ethical is to treat other people in a respectful way, to respect their rights, to do well by them. And what is a business supposed to do? Well, if a business wants to be successful, it's got to provide good value to its various stakeholders. So I've spent a lot of my career talking about stakeholder theory, which is the theory of a firm in relationship to its success relative to how it prioritizes and handles its various stakeholders, from customers to shareholders to community to employees. And a business that's going to last for a long time is a business that has to provide value. And by providing value, it essentially means I'm going to serve you well. And so when I get a student who says, oh gosh, there are no ethics in business, and I say, well, gosh, think about your day today. Did you wake up in a climate controlled environment? Were you sleeping on a mattress that was that was comfortable? Did you go take a shower and get clean water that was warm? And then you took a car that was reliable to get you to work in a climate controlled way? Well, gosh, somebody in business must be doing something right and treating you well for you to have that experience. And so I think there's a fundamental relationship between ethics and success in business, because if you're not treating people well, your stakeholders are going to go away, whether it's your customers or your shareholders or your employees. If they're not being respected, if you're not providing value for them, it's game over. Yeah. So I think they're absolutely linked. I don't just think it's just kind of a, well, is that good for business or not good for business? When we think about ethics as fundamentally how do we treat other people, it's the foundation of business.
Yeah. I like that because it makes it very clear that if you don't do right by your stakeholders, and like you say, stakeholders, if we're looking at stakeholders across the broad spectrum, that includes not just the customers, but it's the staff, because the staff are serving the customers, and it includes your suppliers and all sorts of people across the value chain as well. So I like that. One thing I'm going to ask about, Brad, just as a bit of a counterpoint to that, just being devil's advocate a little bit, because I
Sure.
appreciate what you're saying about people who are not going to be served by a company that doesn't do right by them, and they'll just go elsewhere. But what would you say about, let's say, water companies, for example, like companies that provide municipal water supplies, for example? So in the UK recently, we're having all sorts of issues with water companies who, and the water was privatized, the water supply was privatized in the UK some years ago, and we're having all sorts of issues with these water companies who are behaving very badly, and they're dumping sewage, and they're not maintaining infrastructure, they're not investing in infrastructure, they're taking fat, healthy profits. But customers in that respect can't go somewhere else. So I can't, in my case, I can't leave Yorkshire Water and go to Severn Trent or whoever else it is instead. I have to stay with Yorkshire Water. And so I'm basically at the mercy of them doing the right thing. And as a lot of investigations have shown recently, they haven't, a lot of these water companies, I'm not saying specifically Yorkshire Water, but a lot of these water companies haven't been doing the right thing, and it's a nationwide problem. And I know, speaking to the US as well, there were big problems in Flint, Michigan, with, I think it was lead poisoning that was coming through the water supply there. So what would you say in that? What would you say in that case? All right, okay.
I grew up in Bay City, Michigan, 40 miles from Flint, so I know all about Flint, and its various problems. Take my word for it. When I heard that story, like, yeah, that sounds like Flint, something that would happen in Flint. But to your point, well, you're talking about monopolistic situations. Yeah. And in monopolistic situations, the rules of what I just talked about don't necessarily apply. Now, likely in the long run, it will work itself out, because you as a customer, and as you said, this is a big issue in the UK, which means that communities and customers are speaking up, and they're demanding change. So eventually something is likely to happen. But whenever you have situations where you don't have, where you have market imperfections, right? So Adam Smith, when he talked about capitalism, he talked about free markets, certainly there are assumptions there. One of the assumptions is that people have the ability to come into that market, and you have multiple market players. Where you only have one market player, when you have a monopoly, well, we know there are lots of problems with monopolies, and one of them is the one that you're talking about. You are not necessarily accountable to your stakeholders like you would be in a situation where you could have new entrants to the market. And so we know that monopolies tend to be very good for the company itself. They get monopoly profits, but they're not necessarily good for individuals, customers, etc. At the same time, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there are certain types of situations like water where it doesn't make sense to have competitors. You don't want to have 3 pipes into your house and cutting up the streets for different companies. And so it does make sense to, in certain situations, to have single provider, in which case you need an oversight. And the oversight is we the people, which in generally means our government. And so you kind of move, quite frankly, in that kind of situation, from talking about business ethics to really talking about government ethics, and whether the government is doing its job in a proper fashion. And oftentimes what we find is that in situations where it looks like bad business ethics, in these kinds of situations, it's actually poor governance, which is really government ethics in these situations. So to go to the larger point, is good ethics always good business? And is bad ethics always bad business? No, if it were, it would be. If it were that simple, we wouldn't see any bad ethics. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. There are all kinds of shortcomings in information systems in terms of what people know. So if you think about market imperfections, Adam Smith talked about the need for what he referred to as perfect information. Perfect information. Everybody had all the information they needed to make good decisions. But we know that's not reality in the world that we live in. We don't have time to find all that information, and we don't have all that good information. Fortunately, the market has gotten better and service has gotten better in many ways because of the greater information we're getting. So for example, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, if I wanted to stay in a hotel somewhere in, say, Bath, where I've been for the last month and a half, or any place in the world, it was really hard to get any information. You just kind of had to look and read and see what you could find about a hotel and hope. Today, of course, we have lots of information. If I want to stay at a hotel, I can go read, 10, 100, 1,000 reviews. And that has made it much more critical that those business people act in an ethical fashion, because if they don't, the world's going to know, and the business is going to fail. So in the markets and in products where where stakeholders essentially are able to share their information, and that also is the case with employees, right? So you can go online now and you can talk about your place of employment, and so people who might have gone to work for that company now will go, whoa, yeah, I'm not going to go to work for that company. So if companies are not treating their employees well, all of a sudden there's a market for good information, and they are not going to be able to get the talented people they need to be successful in the future.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say, Brad, someone listening to this podcast, here's what you're saying, thinks, okay, well, I'm going to start my own business. I want to do the right thing. I want to do things the ethical way, but I don't really know how to go about it. I don't really know how to set up the sort of values, the principles, the processes in order to do that. What would you tell them as a starting point to do?
Yeah, well, I do that actually a fair amount with my executive MBA students, who tend to be executives or people who have their own small businesses. Fortunately, there's a lot of really good information on the internet. If you want to, just Google, how do I create a code of ethics, or how do I create a, ethical organization? There's a lot of really good information out there. But the first thing we do is we get together and we say, well, what's valuable to us? What do we care about? And those values and principles are absolutely critical in driving what we're going to do as an organization. In fact, the research shows that the most important thing that drives the ethical culture of an organization, even organizations that have been around for decades and even over 100 years, are the principles of the founders and what happened right at the beginning of the organization. So if you are that person, it's not only kind of important to do, it's absolutely critical if you care about the long-term value proposition that you are creating. So one of the things you do is you say it's a priority, right?
Yeah.
Because it's hard. When you're starting a business, there's a lot of things to do, and it's obviously, we know that most small businesses fail. So we know that it's a difficult thing to do. But if you put in the time to say, as founders, what's critical for us? What are we trying to do? The importance to your stakeholders can't be understated, actually, or can't be overstated, I should say. So my work in stakeholder theory, which talks about how you identify and prioritize your various stakeholders, actually started by my colleague, Ron Mitchell, who's a university professor at Texas Tech University in the United States. He is a professor of entrepreneurship. And the first thing he said when he started reading about stakeholder theory is that that's the key to understanding entrepreneurship. Because if you want to be an entrepreneur, if you want to start a company, what you have to do is you have to get resources from various stakeholders. You have to be able to get customers, but in order to get customers, you also have to have employees. and you've got to be able to, get supplies from whatever it is. So, and you may need community support in some way. So being an entrepreneur really is about identifying the core stakeholders you need to get support from, and then being able to provide them support in a way that satisfies them.
Yeah.
Well, if you're talking about satisfying people, people really resonate with values. And you're going to find the right employees and the right customers. Now, can you have a wrong customer? Well, the reality is you can have a wrong customer. So to find the right stakeholders, people who are really going to support you, it's critical for you to talk about who you are as a company and what are your values and how are you going to support your stakeholders. What principles are you going to use in guiding your relationships with your stakeholders? And then I always say, put somebody in charge of that. When you're a small firm, you're not going to have somebody in charge that spends all their time on that. Later on, you will, but hopefully if you grow, right? That's the idea. But at the beginning, you as a CEO, maybe as the founder, or if you've got a group, somebody to pay attention to that. And the kinds of things you do is you look and you say, well, in this kind of business we're going into, what are the kinds of typical ethical issues we deal with? Because they're different depending on the type of business you're in, right? If you're in a retail business, the ethical issues you face may very well be different from what a bank's going to face or what a manufacturer may face. And so you want to identify the kinds of things that people are going to be dealing with. Now, clearly, there are some fundamental issues that every organization works with, things like sexual harassment. It doesn't matter what kind of business it is, you might have those kinds of issues. So fortunately, there are templates for ethics codes. You can go and, in the United States, there's a group called the Defense Ethics Initiative that actually put out a really good guide to here's a standard code of ethics that deals with all the, typical issues that we know that organizations deal with. And so you can start with that, but then add in the kinds of ethical issues that are going to be more germane to your particular company. And then as leaders, you want to talk to your people about not only are we trying to get good outcomes, but the way we go about getting those good outcomes is also critical for not only the long-term, but also short-term health of our organization.
Yeah, and that's critical, isn't it? And it's a thing about values that really matters, because people talk about those who behave in an unethical way as having no values, and that's actually not true. They do have values. It's just that their values are focused on certain end states, usually involving profit or status or power. But the modes of conduct, values as modes of conduct, because there's different types of values as modes of conduct, are not concerned with supporting the long term. So if you're going to support long-term success, an end state that is desirable in over the long term, i.e. some degree of sustainable success, then the modes of conduct, values from that point of view, have to be aligned in order to support that. So on that thought then, Brad, and thinking and flipping it slightly, so I asked you about what I would do if I was a startup founder and I wanted to establish good ethics in my business. What if I'm an employee of a startup that's going to the sky? It's one of these so-called unicorns, and actually there's something really amiss, and it's not all working out very well. And I'm leading you in here to talk about your knowledge of Theranos and what happened there.
Yeah, so earlier I talked about the market imperfections. And by the way, it's very good insight, Tom. You're absolutely right. There's no value-free executives or companies. I'll have values. The question is, what are those values? Yeah. And there are certainly organizations out there who are just about making money and don't care about how that gets done. And unfortunately, because of those market imperfections, some of those people succeed. I can't ever tell you that, if you're going to be unethical, you're never going to succeed. There are unfortunately far too many counterexamples to that. And one of those counterexamples, at least in the short run, was Theranos. Now, your listeners may not be familiar with Theranos, but when I start to talk about it, you may recognize it. There was a woman named Elizabeth Holmes who started a biotech firm in Silicon Valley, and she rose to the point where she was touted as the first female billionaire in Silicon Valley. And she got a lot of publicity. She raised almost $1 billion in capital, had a market cap of her company at one point of $9 billion. $9 billion. And unfortunately, the machine that she has said that she had that would test blood using just a pin drop worth of blood just didn't work. It was just out and out fraud. And so since then, the fraud was discovered. The way it was discovered were there were 3 whistleblowers, 2 of whom were public, one of whom did not become public until Elizabeth Holmes' trial 2 years ago, when it was discovered who that third person was. But the 2 who were public were a young man named Tyler Schultz and a young woman named Erica Chung, both of whom had recently graduated from college. Tyler Schultz from Stanford University, Erica Chung from the University of California at Berkeley, had started to work at this amazing firm that was going to change the world. Elizabeth Holmes was always about, this is going to benefit mankind. You're coming to work for a company that you can feel great about, when in reality, it was just not true. And so Tyler and Erica figured out that this was just fraudulent. And they ended up blowing the whistle on this. Tyler, who was the grandson of George Schultz, who used to be the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, and George was on the board of directors, which is how Tyler ended up working for the company. Tyler ended up talking to a reporter, John Carreyrou, for the Wall Street Journal, and it came out in the Wall Street Journal. And then Erica Chung also talked to the health department in California. In the end, Theranos went out of business, and Elizabeth Holmes actually just went to prison. She finally went into her started her sentence, I think 2 weeks ago. She'll be in prison for 11 years.
Wow.
So I don't remember the question that started us off.
So in terms of Schultz's process, then, I mean, obviously he's a high profile individual. He's got a big name because of who his grandfather was and the role that he played. He's graduated from Stanford as well, so he's not exactly unemployable. So he does have a degree of jeopardy in this, of course, because this is his employer that he's going against. And not only that, all the hype that was surrounding Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes was incredible. I mean, you've got people like Barack Obama that she's met with, and goodness knows who else. It's kind of like a who's who of the people that are backing her and whooping her on and cheering her from the sidelines. So for Tyler Schultz to come out and speak against this with Erica as well, this notwithstanding that, again, these people aren't unemployable, they're not exactly working at the only place that they can work or anything like that, but there's some jeopardy to them personally in doing this, because being a whistleblower isn't something that's to be taken lightly, is it? So how did they go about that, and how did they decide that something actually had to be done in bringing this to rights?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, and I will tell you that it's been very difficult for both of them. Both the time that they worked at the Theranos and afterwards. It's been very, very difficult for them. So, you're spot on when talking about, if you're going to be a whistleblower, understand this is not an easy path, because it's not. In fact, I'd never been to a criminal trial before, but I wrote a case on Tyler Schultz, and I wrote a case on Erica Chung. So I met them, I talked with them, and so I was very invested in this particular situation. And I wanted to actually see Elizabeth Holmes in person. So I actually flew to California on 2 separate occasions to go to court to watch her trial. And the first day I went, it just so happened that the person on the stand was the investor who had lost the most money in Theranos. The second day I only went because Elizabeth chose to take the stand, which no one expected her to. So I wanted to go actually listen to her. And, she tried, and her defense team tried to make her sound like a victim, that she was, hurt badly through all of this. And I was just sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I remember when I interviewed Erica Chung in Hong Kong, and she was crying, talking about how difficult it was for her to be a new employee, just graduated. She was the daughter of immigrants to the United States. She had gotten into one of the top universities in the country, had graduated, had gone to work for this high-flying firm. Her parents were so proud. And now she's in charge, or not in charge, but she's one of the people who's supposed to be testing this machine to ensure that the tests are accurate. And she can't get the test to work. And she can't afford to live where Theranos is in the Bay Area. She has to cross over the bridge, the Bay Bridge, to go where she can afford to live. And for weeks, she's working 20 hours a day, driving home, sleeping for 3 hours, driving back across the bridge in the middle of the night, and just devastated because she can't get this to work. All the pressure she has on her. And she's telling her parents, and I need to quit this company. And her parents are just like, well, you can't do that. You got loans you have to repay. And this is the most amazing company. And so it was devastating to her. And Tyler, when I talked to Tyler, he said, there were 3 years where I couldn't talk to anyone. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to not be able to talk to anyone for 3 years? He said when he talked to his lawyer said, you can talk to 3 people. You can talk to your spouse, you can talk to your religious leader, and you can talk to your lawyer. Wow. And Tyler said, I'm not married, I'm not religious, and you, my lawyer, are really expensive to talk to.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
So he went 3 years just, having to deal with this, having all this weight on himself, without being able to talk to other people. There were people who were spying on him. I mean, he slept with a knife under his pillow because he was afraid of what might happen. And I'm still in contact with both of them. And it's continued to be a hard road. They're both, pleased that they did it because they stopped the harm that was occurring, but they paid a personal price to help you and me. Yeah. So you say, when did it, finally get to the point where they did, had to do something? And for Tyler, it was when they were testing for syphilis.
Right.
And they tested the employees, and they found that I don't remember what the number is, but some very high percentage of the employees of Theranos had syphilis. Which it's like, okay, that's scary one way or another, right?
Yeah.
Either it's scary that everybody has syphilis, or it's scary that the test is not working accurately. And Tyler was pretty certain it was the second case, right? It's just this test is not working, because none of the tests are working very well. And so he just said, I've got to do something, because at that point, Theranos had started actually using the machine with Walgreens. So they had a contract with Walgreens. They were putting spaces in those Walgreens where people go get their blood tested by Theranos and get these results back. And people are starting to get the incorrect medical results, whether it's you're pregnant or you're not, or you have cancer or you're not, you have syphilis or you're not. And he said, I can't sit around and and allow that to happen. And so said, I have to do something.
Yeah. Yeah. So thinking about this, Brad, it seems very clear to me, and I early on in my career, I really do sympathize. I can't at all fully empathize with Erica and Tyler, but I can certainly sympathize with them, because quite early on in my career, I had certain situations where I was working for organizations which had all of the good values plastered over the website, and they were working in a benevolent sector which is helping disadvantaged people. But actually, and this is where a biblical analogy comes to mind of whited sepulchres, that they seemed like they were whited sepulchres, and sometimes it was the organization and the way things were actually done on the ground, and sometimes it was with maybe a business partner that I was working with as well, and it was very much that things on the outside were presented in a certain way, but behind closed doors and in practice things were very different. So how would you advise people? I mean, I'm older, uglier, and wiser now than I was then, but how would you advise people, Brad, to avoid that situation in the first place? Because I can say from a much smaller perspective than Erica and Tyler that you don't want to be there in the first place. So how can people avoid being there in the first place, where they get embroiled in other people's mess, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and one that I don't think most people spend enough time thinking about when they're looking for employment or changing employment. And to your earlier point, it's sort of interesting. I think most people would be surprised to find out that the information or data on ethics issues or unethical behavior in organizations finds that you find just as much unethical behavior in charitable organizations and nonprofit organizations as you do in for-profit organizations.
Yeah.
So you can't just simply assume that because the government, this organization is trying to do good in the world, that means that behind closed doors there aren't issues, because there often are, and in fact, just as often as issues. Excuse me, I think I've got something in the background. Oh, I know what oh, that's the ship's captain. Sorry.
Okay, I can't hear him, so.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's, it doesn't matter what kind of organization you're looking into joining, there could very well be those issues. So here's the advice that I give to people who are looking for a job or looking to change employment. We talk about imperfect information, and that's really true. There is Glassdoor, which you can go on. I don't know if it's in the UK or not.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So I mean, there's some information out there, and you should obviously look for public information at first, but then you should definitely try to get more information before you join an organization. Now, that's difficult information to get, and I'm not suggesting to my folks that in their first interview that they say, so tell me about ethics issues, etc. It's like, yeah, that may not be the place to start, but at the point that the organization is figuring out they want you, at that point, you should actually start to provide some ethical scenarios and say, so what would the organization expect me to do in this situation?
Yeah.
So you say, well, where do I get those ethics issues? It may be ones you've faced in the past yourself, but there are a lot of publications that kind of help you with that. So we met when I just published a book called The Business Ethics Field Guide. And that Business Ethics Field Guide looks at ethical dilemmas from the perspective of, the executive MBAs I've been teaching for over 20 years. So they all have to write up some ethical dilemma they faced in their career. And that was those hundreds and hundreds of ethical dilemmas I got from my executive MBA students are the foundation of that book. And my co-authors, Aaron Miller and Bill O'Rourke and I, we actually went through and we tried to figure out what are the fundamental ethical issues people face in organizational life. That's what the book was about. We found that there are really 13 foundational issues that people face. Now, the details, of course, those are numerous. But when you boil it down to what's the fundamental issue, there are 13 of them. And if someone is looking to try to get a sense of the principles of the organization or values of the organization, I suggest that they go to that book, which has hundreds of ethical dilemmas in it, or other such sources, find some that they find interesting, and then say, here's a situation. What would you as my employer expect me to do in this situation?
Yeah. Okay.
And ask that question of a few people, and that can be enlightening, right?
Yes.
I mean, if they pause, you can learn from that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I suggest, and this is where you've already got an offer in hand.
Yeah.
I suggest you say, I really am impressed by your organization around all those kinds of things. Is say, but I also find that it's really useful to talk to people who have recently worked for the company but are now working somewhere else. Give me the contact information for 2 other people who had worked for your organization, for your department, etc., but who have left.
Yeah.
I just like to talk to them.
Yeah. And that's like you're interviewing them at that point, isn't it? It's where you've, like you say, you've done your bit, you've proved that you're competent, capable, desirable to them enough to be hired, and then you're turning around and say, okay, right, now let's talk about the things that are important to me. And like you say, asking intelligent questions about, well, okay, so what would you do in X, Y, or Z situation? And can I have some testimonials, if you like? You're pretty much asking them to give testimonials from people who have, in some respects, use their service, because in some respects, employees are customers as well of the company. So it's interesting to hear what they've got to say as well. So I really like that approach. I think it's something that is highly necessary and something that is required in doing due diligence on a future employer, because it does make a big difference in terms of who you've got on your CV, on your resume. Because if you have got a Theranos on your resume, then you've got a story to tell, and that adds complexity. It makes things complicated. It can slow things down. It can maybe breed a degree of maybe distrust in some respect, whether it's from an ethical point of view or from a competence point of view. And people just don't want to be telling those stories, do they? They just want to steer well clear of those stories in their career and have, make everything simple. If you want someone to do something, and that includes hiring you, make it easy for them to do. So we want to avoid those things altogether.
And I have to say, for someone like you, Tom, who's got, some experience and has some confidence, doing that kind of thing is a little bit easier than someone who's really early in their career.
Yeah.
It's a really hard thing to, literally suggest to your employer that I don't just trust what you say, because that's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah.
But well, what? But people who've been around the block,
yes,
they understand, right?
Yeah.
Even the person that's trying to hire you, they understand, because they know darn well that if they're, they've either at the organization they're at or other organizations they've been at, they know that there are, skeletons in the closet. They know things are not as perfect as they're talking about. In fact, I've talked to people who have been hiring people while they're leaving the organization because of ethical issues. And they're literally struggling themselves, because here I am telling this young person, or it doesn't even have to be a young person, but telling this person to come to work for organization. Meanwhile, I know in my own mind that I'm leaving the organization because how unethical it is.
Yeah.
So that's my way of saying, for people who are not as confident in themselves and their position, understand that you're in a stronger position than you think you are, and you really ought to have that confidence. And again, it's at the point where they've already made you an offer, or at least they're close to making you an offer. So it's not, I'm not going to tell anybody to do that in the first interview, but when it's clear that they want you, then I also think that's a good signal to the employer that you're taking this very seriously. And the only people who are going to be offended by that are people you don't want to go to work for.
Yeah, exactly.
So if someone gets really defensive about that, that's a pretty big red flag right there. Yeah,
that's exactly what I was going to say. That's a red flag. As soon as you start seeing someone shuffling or getting uncomfortable when they're asked those sort of questions, that's a sign in and of itself that something's not as it seems or as it's been presented. It goes back to that old adage, doesn't it? Trust but verify. You know, you need to verify something that somebody's telling you. Like, fine, I'm gonna trust you to a point, but actually, I want some verification on this as well, so that I don't get led all the way down the garden path.
I mean,
So
the employer you work for is huge.
yeah,
Right? I mean, anybody who's changed jobs or who's lost a job knows that, you know, that's huge. And if you go to work for the right employer, the right boss, it can have huge positive implications for your life. And when you end up going to work for the wrong boss or the wrong organization, can really be painful. And so you want to make sure that you do your due diligence.
Yeah, I think this is the thing, isn't it? It's almost one of those things that is absolutely necessary in relation to personal branding as well, because personal branding is so big now in the age of social media. People are very much clued up about using social media for personal branding and how they present themselves online and all these sorts of things. But I just wonder how much of a blind spot it is in terms of the importance of getting work for the right companies, for the right people, and not slipping on those banana skins by working for the wrong people in the wrong companies, because that does affect your brand. Again, it's you're putting your name on that company's roster, and that company's name is on your CV. So there's an exchange there. And so for your brand, again, going back to that idea of telling a story, you want to make sure that the story's clear, that the story's clean as much as it can be, and that you're not working with anybody or for anybody whose name or reputation or misbehavior is going to tarnish that. Brad, this has been a really interesting conversation.
And Tom, it's just a lot more fun
Yeah,
to work for people who are ethical than to have to deal with people who are not ethical. It's just life is just a lot funner and a lot better.
Yeah, I think that is the point, isn't it? It's that life is better working for good people who care about you and about all of the stakeholders, and where there is that degree of trust. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Brad. I'm going to ask you now, if I may, just in closing, in terms of ethics, I think a lot of people default to integrity, and integrity is a word that gets used a lot, and a lot of lip service is paid to integrity. And it gets put up on all of the websites and all the lists of values and principles that companies trot about the place. And I would hope that it's self-evident as to why integrity is important, although there are other academics who might argue that it's not so well practiced in reality. I know that Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford Business School, he's written quite a bit about leadership in reality versus the notional idea of leadership, and his work is quite interesting in that regard. So I'm going to ask you now, Brad, just in wrapping up, what would you say is an ethical principle? And you can use integrity if you want, but what is an ethical principle that to you is an absolute must for an organization to be successful over the long term?
Well, there's a reason people use integrity.
Yeah.
It probably is as fundamental as you get, but you have to understand what integrity is. So there are really two aspects to integrity, right? The first aspect to integrity is truth telling. And the second principle of integrity is acting in concert with your stated principles or your stated values. So those two, and a lot of people forget the second part.
Yeah.
People just use integrity as honesty, which isn't bad to begin with, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
they were just started off with honesty, but if we put those two together, do you want to work for a company or a boss who is truthful and lives according to the principles that they state? That's a pretty good basis to have a good working relationship. Because if they had principles that they state that you don't agree with, you're probably not working for them, right? So I think integrity is as good as it comes. Certainly the values that you care about, I think, respecting the dignity of all, and being fair and truthful with all, are important principles, but if you understand the idea of integrity, it sort of, covers all of that.
Yeah.
And so I think integrity is as good a standard as there is. You talked about, people talk about it, but they don't necessarily live it. And that's the key, right? Enron.
Yes.
Maybe your young listeners haven't even heard of Enron, right? It was probably the biggest business ethics story of the last 50 years, right? And they had 4 wonderful values that they had plastered all over the organization. They just didn't live it.
Yeah.
So actually living the integrity is what's critical.
Yeah, I really like that. And it speaks to truth to self, being true to yourself, being true to who you are. So it renders it entirely not just pointless, but counterproductive to state a value that you don't actually live. Don't even go there. Don't even bother putting it on the website. Don't even bother presenting in that way if you're not going to live it, because that's not who you are. Don't do that if that's not who you are. I really respect business leaders who are sometimes a little bit more rough around the edges, and they're a little bit gruff, that there aren't as many airs and graces about them. I often respect those folks a lot more than the ones who appear to be really polished, really polite, really nice, but actually they're more likely to have a dagger in your back than the one who's a little bit brusque, a little bit gruff, and will tell you what he or she thinks. Because I always feel like I know where I am with the one who's brusque. I feel like they are actually being honest. And okay, you might say that they could be a little bit more considerate in how they deliver information and how they communicate, but at least you know what the truth is. With the one who presents a persona in a certain way and doesn't reveal their selves, their true thoughts on things, you're never quite sure. You're never quite sure whether there is going to be a knife in your back. And I would personally rather know where I stand with people than always be guessing and trying to look for codes and clues in how people say things and what people put in emails and deciphering things, because that seems to waste an awful lot of time and create a great deal of anxiety in a workforce as well. So lots to think about there, Brad. Really great conversation. I'm really, really glad to have you on. I think that there's a lot that listeners can take away from this in terms of how they can set up their own gig in an ethical way, how they can ensure that they're working for somebody who is behaving in an ethical way, and how to get off on the right foot with ethics as well. Because I really strongly believe that ethics, values, principles that are, well, or should I say values that are aligned with correct principles, are the absolute foundation of sustainable success, not just for the individual, but also for the organization. And even if you extrapolate it further, society as a whole. So Brad Agle, thank you so much for your time on the Real Clear Values podcast.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be with you.